Us guys, Ryan Hauser here with Average Joe Karate. So I want to go over in this little lesson just a very small, quick overview of both sort of karate, its origins, if you will, very high level, and then Shotokan karate as well, and where it fits into that. Obviously now you've been practicing Shotokan karate, and you probably know a little bit about it, but just in case, we want to make sure you do have a high level understanding of what Shotokan is, Shotokan karate, how it's a little bit different, and just the overall history of karate. So karate, first of all, began in what's now Okinawa, which is technically one of the home islands of Japan, but it wasn't always so. It was originally part of a group of islands known as the Ryukyu Kingdom. So it was its own independent kingdom, small islands. It had a lot of trade because it's just there, sort of to the southwest, really south of Japan. And also, you've got China right next to it in the west, and the Philippines, and Indonesia, a lot of other places. So there's all this trade in that area, if you want to think of it that way. So Okinawa was very important. There always had been indigenous, styles of hand fighting, things like that. A lot of times we talk about ti or te. Te now in Japanese, of course, means hand. But eventually, around the 1300s, the 14th century, Okinawa became a tributary state, so almost like a province of China. Not necessarily China proper, but almost like a protectorate, if you want to think of it that way. So it was a lot more exchange of ideas and things, a lot of heavy Chinese influence, a lot of, they paid sort of taxes or tribute to China. The Chinese actually even set up a permanent court, if you will, within the Shuri Palace, which was the capital, the palace of the Ryukyu Kingdom, Okinawa. And so there was this huge exchange. You had a lot of kung fu and fighting styles, particularly from southern China, like the Fujian province, white crane karate, or white crane kung fu, things like that, and that came down and were heavily influenced karate and the indigenous fighting styles of the Okinawans. Now, one of the myths, just to clear it off real quick, is that karate was something that the peasants used because, weapons were banned, and so people had to learn how to fight with their, with no weapons, etc. Not really quite true. A little is misleading anyway. Number one, karate and the type of fighting styles that it came from and what it became was not for the peasants. As a matter of fact, most of these people, caste system in Okinawa, even at this time, when it was a tributary state of the Chinese, was pretty similar to Japan. So you have sort of a social hierarchy or pecking order. And the lower classes would have been consumed with farming and at the very lowest, like merchants. And if you think about it, you're working all day, really from sunrise to sunset, cultivating things. You're not at the end of the day really going to have the time or probably even physical strength to practice karate or learn karate or martial arts. So it was really, in particular, the Shuri Palace Court, so the elites, and the nobility around the rest of the country. And you had three primary locales, if you will. You had the Shuri Palace, you had Naha, which today Naha is the capital of Okinawa, and Shuri was actually, today, the recreation of the Shuri Palace is in Naha, right? So they would have been very close even back then, but obviously not having cars and transportation, still even a mile or two would have been a lot, maybe an hour long walk. And then you also had Tamare, which was a port, much further located away. And so what happened is you had three different distinct sort of styles, different masters, et cetera, that developed with karate. You had Shurite, Nahate, and Tamarate. And of course, again, te just means hand, so it was just a way of saying, the fighting style or hand of Shuri, the fighting style or hand of Naha, the fighting style or hand of Tamare, and it sort of developed that way. Now, around the 1600s, around the 1600s, the 17th century, the Satsuma clan, which was part of Japan, one of the main clans on sort of the southwest of Japan, invaded and took over Okinawa. Now, the Chinese and sort of the vassal king of Ryukyu had banned, during the Chinese tributary period, certain weapons. But it's very important to note that karate traditionally always did involve weapons, even during the weapons ban. We'll come back to that in a minute. But you definitely used weapons, and people would have been trained in weapons. Today we call Kabuto, the ancient martial way. But then Budo and fighting would have included, open hand like we do now in Shotokan karate, but also weapons. But there was a weapons ban, and the Satsuma clan definitely thought, well, since we're conquerors from a foreign country, that makes plenty of sense to us. And so fast forward a little later. Eventually, Japan really gets pushed around by a lot of Western powers to open itself up. It had been very closed and isolated, didn't let foreigners out in, didn't let other people out, generally speaking. You had like 1 or 2 ports where certain official traders could trade with the Japanese, but not many. Changed when Commodore Perry from the United States came in, and then the British. And so it really opened up Japan by force, but then also the Japanese began to have what they called the Meiji Restoration. Big changes, control being taken from the shogun and the shogunate to the emperor. And the other thing they did is they began to take Okinawa, and instead of it being part of the Satsuma clan, it became part of Japan proper. It became essentially like one of the home islands. The other thing that happened is with that happening, of course, the weapons ban and other things kind of began to go away. The class structures that existed in Japan were very stagnant. Like whatever class you were in, you were born and you were going to die in that class. There was no mobility. So with the Meiji Restoration, the samurai class, the warrior class, a lot of this class system was officially ended. Things like the top knot that samurais could wear, gone, etc. And you saw the same thing with Okinawa. Okinawa's caste system is a little bit more intricate than Japan's with the nobility, etc. But same thing. With that, karate came more out in the open, and you had certain masters, particularly 2 masters, Ako Ituso and Azato, who taught Gishin Funakoshi, who's important later. He's the founder of Shotokan karate. These 2 older masters, particularly Ituso, if I'm pronouncing that right, began to try to get karate more into the public, to in particular get into schools as a way to, physical education, sort of better the kids on the island physically. They also began to, in the 19th century, and really before as well, imbibe a lot of Buddhist and spiritual philosophy and ideas into karate too. So they saw it even then as a way not only to improve people physically, but mentally. And so they thought it was important to get in the school system, and they began to do that, particularly in Shuri is where it started. Now, during this time, during the Meiji Restoration, Gishin Funakoshi was born. He was a rather sickly, small child. I myself am quite small. But he was part of the nobility, technically, and so karate would have been open to him. And again, this was a time when things were opening up a little bit more in general anyway. But he was sent to study with these 2 masters. And so he studied, he really, and his family and others saw how he became very adept at karate, how it improved his life and made him more physically strong, etc. So as Okinawa became more ingrained into Japanese culture, or at least they were trying to, of course you had more cultural exchange. In particular, the Japanese Navy would come through the Okinawan islands in Okinawa, and through that, masters like Gishin Funakoshi in particular became known to them, and karate kind of began to spread into the Navy. Eventually, Gishin, who has an interesting pen name, which is Shoto, which sort of means waving pines. He wrote poetry, and he liked to go up in the mountains and watch, the wind move the pines, and so he wrote under the name Shoto. He moves, and at this point, he's 40s, 50s, later in life, to Tokyo to begin to teach and kind of spread karate. He had already met, actually, at this time, he was not the Emperor Hirohito, he was the prince, but he had met him, he had met many in the Navy, and so karate had started to kind of seep into Japanese culture a little bit. But Funakoshi started small. He started working with members of judo. He started making changes with karate. So what I mean by that, so first of all, the name, karate. Remember we talked about the Chinese influence. Kara is a homonym, so it can mean empty hand, which is what we say now. But back then it meant tang, your Chinese hand, because it had very heavy Chinese influence. And in Okinawa, even during the Satsuma period, they very much valued the Chinese. Okay, so a lot of people, including Gishin Funakoshi, would have studied Chinese. They would have studied Chinese culture and philosophy, etc. But for the Japanese, particularly during this time, pre-World War II, wasn't so, culturally acceptable for things that were Chinese to come into Japan. So one, Gishin was very influential with some other karate masters of changing it from karate, Chinese hand, to kara, which can also mean empty te hand, karate, which is how it's written in kanji now, and what we translate it as now as well. Funakoshi also changed the names of some of the kata, particularly the Heian kata, which were created, I believe, by Azato. At least that's what most scholars believe. They were originally the Pinan kata. So he began to change that. What we now know as the Teki katas in Shotokan also were named differently. Also names changed, Basai Dai. All of these got more Japanese names. That was the first change. And, Japan, really took to karate. They were looking for something to compete with Western pugilism, boxing. Karate, they didn't really have anything like that. Karate kind of filled that gap. So going back to weapons. So with most of the first adherents being judoka, so practicing judo, which is a grappling throwing art, and the fact they're really looking more for boxing, they really gravitated to more of the open hand, kicking, punching aspect of karate. But bear in mind that karate has and will always have a grappling and throwing component, ground, newaza techniques, and it also involves weapons. There is no Shotokan syllabus of weapons for the reason that when it being sort of the earliest modern karate, the first traditional karate, that just wasn't allowed, or it wasn't something that people were interested in. So that's why today, in a lot of traditional Shotokan schools, even like ours, if you offer a syllabus in weapons, there is no Shotokan syllabus. It could be freestyle, it could be Yamane Ryu, it could be Ryukyu, Kabuto, which is what I typically gravitate toward. So know that. Some other interesting changes. So as karate got to Japan, Gishin, and particularly his son, he was known as Gichi, but that's not his actual first name, began to also accommodate the Japanese by making karate more sport-like. So deeper, longer stances, more of an idea of, to stop a fight with one blow. Iken Hisatsu, which is still also important, and it's a concept in Okinawan traditional karate as well. But so you start to see, and this is where Shotokan's different, these much longer stances, front stance, we have Kokotsudachi, the back stance, versus in Okinawa, a lot of times the back stance was just Niko Ashidachi, what we call cat stance. Front stance would have been more like Aramoto Dachi in Shotokan. So that's a big thing, stylistically. In Shotokan, you see much longer stances, and there's a few reasons. One, again, the Japanese concept of they were transforming karate into a do, which means way. So losing some of the martial aspect to also be something now that is a sport aspect, a self-improvement, mental and physical aspect. So it became much more diverse in terms of its aims and goals. Funakoshi understood this, and his son definitely understood it and kind of broadened that out as well. Additionally, the idea was that with the stances getting longer and the Kion being practiced the way it was, it allowed people to condition their legs. So that even though you don't fight like that, if you're doing these big long stances, you're really going to be working on your legs. It helps your kicks, it helps your endurance, helps a lot of things. You're basically doing calisthenics. Eventually, obviously, Gishin Funakoshi passed away, but it can't be, I think, overstated what he did for karate. But from him, the style that he taught and his son became known as Shotokan, the first sort of traditional, but yet really first modern karate style. Again, if we go back to what we talked about, Shoto means waving pines. When his students, because you had people that did judo, and you had a lot of university students in particular, and they would usually just practice at university, finally got their own training hall. And his students basically just named it Shotokan for him. Kan means like hall or training hall, similar to dojo, but a little bit more different connotation. So Shotokan literally means the training hall of Shoto, or waving pines, and really named after Gishin Funakoshi. He never went about trying to necessarily create a style or have it named the way it was, but that's what it became known as. A lot of the things we think of in martial arts today, not just karate, like the dogi, this came from judo, from the creator of judo, Jigaro Kano, and Gishin Funakoshi knew him well. So this was adopted in karate. The belt system, so that came from judo as well. In the early days, you had swimmers who, when they reached a certain level of proficiency in Japan, would get a black armband to show their level of competency. So along with the dogi, judo adopted a system of if you got a certain level of competency, you got a black belt. All of that was adopted into karate by Gishin Funakoshi. Originally, it was just you had a black belt, then white and black. And then now, of course, depending on the style, the dojo, the association, there's all kind of colors of the rainbow between white, which is beginner, and black. In Okinawa, what's very interesting is a lot of the Okinawan styles, even though they are more upright, close-in fighting, concerned with that type of style versus the long stances of Shotokan, a lot of things were taken back from Japan to Okinawa. That's why if you go to Okinawa to this day, even in Okinawan karate, you'll see dogis, you'll see, belts, things like that. So again, there was a huge impact with that Gishin Funakoshi had. I'll try to put some links up within our site, www.averagejoekarate.com. Feel free to take a look, learn a little bit more about the history of Shotokan. I would definitely recommend anything written by Gishin Funakoshi. His autobiography in particular also it's a very quick read, but it's also very interesting. You can kind of get to the mindset of what a lot of these early karateka thought.